Good afternoon and welcome back to Lunch and Learn, a joint partnership between the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. My name is Tiana Davis. I'm the Outreach Specialist with the Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. With me as co hosts today are Kyla Hannington, also from the Office of Human Rights, and Dr. Audrey Lau, the Adult and Senior Services Specialist with the library. Our office investigates complaints of discrimination, combats human trafficking around the region, ensures equitable access to county government services for all people in the language of their preference, and educates on matters of civil rights and social justice importance. Lunch and Learn debuted in the summer of 2024 and has brought to you a whole host of interesting people, from NASA astronauts and scientists to scholars to authors. We are excited today to welcome Briana Thomas. Briana's writing and research serves as a platform to amplify diverse voices and narratives. Through her articles, books, and other forms of media, she brings attention to the often overlooked or marginalized stories that have shaped the fabric of America. Briana is the author of the Black history book, Black Broadway in Washington, D.C., and a contributing author to the travel book Where to Go When, The Americas. She is the arts and culture writer for the Washingtonian Magazine and a frequent contributor to Smithsonian Magazine. Briana co hosts a weekly culture segment on WTOP Radio. She earned a Master of Journalism degree from the University of Maryland College Park and a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Communications from Greensboro College. Briana is a licensed DC tour guide and the founder of walking tour company Black Broadway Travel, which has been featured on television networks such as ABC, NBC, and CBS. Welcome, Briana. Can you talk to us a little bit? Can you introduce yourself in your own words?
Yes. Well, hi, everybody. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to start off 2025 with this Lunch and Learn series with you all. So, that bio was a good summary of all the things that I've done. But a brief background about myself is that I am a Washington, D.C. area journalist by trade, which is what kind of introduced me into studying DC Black history and how I wrote the book Black Broadway in Washington, D.C., which is a project that I've started working on almost 10 years ago now. And I can't even believe that it's been that long. But the book came out a few years ago and it continues to be a spotlight for Black history. And I'm super excited to talk about this even before we get into Black History Month. So, how about that?
You have some slides here today. Are you ready to get those on screen?
Yes, we will go through this. So I'm going to skip around just a little bit because there's a lot of pictures you will notice. I love historic photos and also present day photos. I have a walking tour company that's based on the book where I take people throughout the U Street corridor and teach them about the Black Broadway history that's featured in my book. So this is going to be like a mini version of that tour, except for we're going to do it virtually. Okay. So I've already introduced myself. So let's get right into it. So let's go to the next slide. So first off, what is Black Broadway? So I do like to be interactive, so feel free to put it in the chat. You can go ahead and take your guesses about what is Black Broadway. But usually when people hear the name Broadway, they immediately think of a specific city, and it's not Washington, D.C. What city is it?
Can we answer too?
Yes.
New York.
New York. Yes, you can answer too. And if you want to shout out anything that's in the chat too, please definitely do that. But yes, you think of New York. You think of the Broadway district, the theater district with the nightlife and the music and the plays, right? And the performance art. However, Washington, D.C. has their very own Broadway, and has a lot to do with Black history. So during the early 1900s to about the mid 1900s, the U Street Corridor neighborhood, which is located in Washington, D.C., and it encompasses Shaw, even a little bit of Cardoza neighborhoods as well. This neighborhood was home to more than 300 Black owned businesses, about 100 Black churches, an array of after hours, jazz spots, nightclubs, juke joints, whatever you wanted to call it, depending on where you were visiting from. During this time period where there were segregation laws and Jim Crow. And so if you were a person of color during this time, it didn't matter how talented you were, it didn't matter how smart you were, or even how rich you were. Simply because of the color of your skin, you could be outlawed from performing at certain theaters in America or even going to a movie in downtown DC. But within the U Street quarter, these neighborhoods, this neighborhood, this area, these theaters, these nightclubs, they were unsegregated. And so people of all colors flocked to the neighborhood to have a good time, but also as a safe haven away from the harshness of Jim Crow. And so that is Black Broadway. You can go to the next slide. The picture you're seeing, actually, that's the Republic Theater, which no longer exists. But this is a newspaper clipping from the Afro-American newspaper, which is still around today. It's a historic Black newspaper in Washington, D.C. I actually wrote for them at one point. Before I started history, believe it or not, here's a fun fact. I was a crime reporter in Washington, D.C. So I know.
I'll be talking to you more about that for sure.
Yeah, so I've covered a number of beats in DC journalism, but history is definitely, I would say, my favorite for sure. But if you're a jazz fan, or maybe you grew up during this era, like my grandmother did, who is who I dedicated my book to, Evelyn Thomas, because she was the first person to share her U Street narrative with me. She partied on Black Broadway. She saw people like Moms Mabley, the comedian, performing at Howard Theater. And then later on, you had James Brown and Aretha Franklin, all these cool folks that performed during a time where it wasn't really popular or safe to be Black in America. But they were making a way for others and the successes that we now know today. So you can go to the next slide. So I can't see your hands, but you can just raise your hand wherever you are if you've ever heard of the Harlem Renaissance. I'm sure most hands are up. Yes. Okay. But my next question is, have you heard of a DC Renaissance? No hands. I know. Okay, but this is why I decided to write the book. So it started as a photo story essay that I was writing for Washingtonian Magazine back in 2016. And I was uncovering the forgotten history of U Street. And I knew the story somewhat because my grandmother used to take me sightseeing and tell me all the places she used to go. But I had never looked at it from a researcher standpoint. And researching this history, I discovered that a lot of the big name artists that we are so familiar with from the jazz renaissance era of the 20s and the 30s, and even parts of the 40s, like Duke Ellington, for instance, or Ella Fitzgerald, Pearl Bailey, Miles Davis, Louis Armstrong, the list goes on and on. A lot of them are associated with the boom of the Harlem Renaissance, but they actually started off in DC first with the DC Renaissance. The DC Renaissance begins with the opening of the theater you are looking at right now on the screen, and it is the Howard Theater. And the Howard was opened in 1910. Now, the Apollo Theater opens in the early 1930s. So about 20 years prior to the famous Apollo Theater in New York hosting these Black artists, you actually have these artists performing at the Howard Theater, starting their careers at talent shows, booking shows as sports personalities, and even there were circuses inside the theater. They don't do circuses at the Howard now, probably for good reason. I don't even know how they used to fit a circus inside. But nonetheless, this is a place for fun and entertainment and for people to just have a good time and express themselves. And here's another cool part, to get paid for their work. During this time, even if you were a popular artist, it was also important that you got paid to perform. You can go to the next slide. I think I have a photo of a special person. Okay, this is a guessing game. Who can tell me who this guy is?
I have a guess, but I'm scared to be wrong.
Actually, I'm just going to say for everybody watching at home, I just really want to encourage you to use the chat. We're going to share it with Briana wherever you're watching. If you want to answer some of her questions or chime in, please. We want this to be interactive. So, Tiana, if you want to hold back, we can just wait. until someone types in the
Yes, I want to hear your answers. Who is this jazzy guy?
All right. You don't have to answer yet while we're still waiting for answers, but I'm going to say Duke Ellington.
You are correct. It
Oh.
is Ellington. Round of applause. Yes. Duke Ellington. I usually get Duke Ellington, and some people think it's Cab Calloway. And Cab Calloway also is a Black Broadway star, actually one of my favorite. But Duke Ellington was born and raised in Washington, D.C. He was born as Edward Kennedy Ellington, and he grew up in the U Street quarter. He actually grew up on T Street. In fact, he lived in 14 different places throughout Washington, D.C., so not one neighborhood can claim him, but Black Broadway can claim him because he spent most of his childhood. He went to high school in the area, and he performed his very first show ever on the U Street quarter as well. This is a photograph of him performing at the Howard Theater in the 40s. Duke Ellington composed and arranged more than 6,000 jazz works over the span of his career. He's one of the top jazz artists of all time. And of course, he's our favorite DC jazz son. That's why we have a school named after Duke Ellington, a bridge and murals everywhere where you can, really pay homage to his music. So I don't sing at all. Sometimes that's the question. So I won't be doing any karaoke, but I do have a number of favorite Duke Ellington songs, and one of them is Take the A Train. And another fun fact that I like to share about Duke Ellington and kind of how he traveled internationally, but also nationally. When he went to New York during the Harlem Renaissance to perform, his band name was called the Washingtonians. So although he went to other places, he still always kept his DC connection. And I just love that fact about him. And a lot of other artists that went on to have bigger careers outside of the DC area. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so you can kind of you don't have to say this one aloud. I just want you to look at this photo. So this is on 14th and U Streets. And if you come take a walking tour with me, we walk and see this in person. This is a very interesting mural for a number of reasons. One, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? He's in a male person's uniform, but also playing a saxophone. I've never seen this in real life. But the reason this is like this is because it is really symbolizing a very popular jazz figure who didn't really get popular outside of DC, and only because he loved the city so much he never wanted to leave it. And his name is Buck Hill. So Buck Hill was just as talented as John Coltrane and Miles Davis and some of those other artists that you are familiar with because they toured around the world and around the United States. But Buck Hill would say, hey, I have mouths to feed. I'm not going to quit my day job, which was him working at the post office, which is why there's the uniform there. And he was known as the Wailing Mailman because he would get up and go to work early to practice before work. And as soon as he got off work, he would go and perform at one of the nearby jazz clubs. And there were jazz clubs all up and down 14th Streets, 12th, and 13th as well. Something else I'll share about this mural is it is the tallest mural in Washington, D.C. that's dedicated to one person, just only one person. So that tells you the impact that Black Broadway and jazz has on the city, that one of its biggest murals is dedicated to a jazz historic figure. Next slide. You can skip this one. I think I have a better picture of the Lincoln. Yes, I do. So that was just showing the Lincoln Theater kind of before it was restored in 1994. This is actually a photo of what the Lincoln looked like in the 80s. If you saw it present day, it kind of looks the same. There's just different things in the windows. But the Lincoln Theater opened in 1922. In the chat, let me know. Anyone been to the Lincoln Theater? Let me know what your favorite show was. But the Lincoln Theater opened in 1922 as a movie theater, and it was actually segregated at first for Black people. Then it was unsegregated, which means everyone could come. They tuned the theater for sound, started showing Hollywood pictures, but because it's Black Broadway, seeing a movie was not enough entertainment. There had to be more party going on. So in the basement of the Lincoln Theater, they built the Lincoln Colonnade. And this is what made this theater become what was called the Jewel of U Street. So Billie Holiday performed at the Colonnade. Nat King Cole performed there. Ruth Brown, Sarah Vaughan, of course, Duke Ellington, and even President Franklin D. Roosevelt held some of his birthday parties there. So imagine, us hanging out now and you see the president or vice president just showing up at the theater. But this really was the spirit of Black Broadway. You never knew who you could run into. So it continues to be true today, although the jazz scene has faded some, actually a lot. But the music and the entertainment, we are seeing somewhat of a revival of that spirit within the U Street Corridor. All right, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit. So you can skip this slide. You can skip this. That's a video of Ella Fitzgerald. And this is what the Lincoln looks like present day. So they still have their sign lit up. They are more than 100 years old now. We can move forward from the entertainment scene. And I want to talk a little bit about another aspect of my book and its research, because it was the nightlife and the entertainment that gave Black Broadway the name Black Broadway, which was actually coined by Pearl Bailey, the singer and Broadway actress. But in order to go out to a show or a movie theater, you need money, right? You need money to buy the tickets. So you have to have a job. And you can't have a job if you don't have any place to work, right? So all of these things make up a community. But segregation affected every aspect of life. So if your child was sick, you couldn't take your kid as a Black woman or Black man downtown to a doctor's office. That wasn't allowed. So you had to become a doctor, right? The same thing, whether you need a lawyer or you needed to bury a loved one. There were a lot of lucrative Black-owned funeral homes. And then there were other things like restaurants and cleaners and tailors and all these things that encompass a community. So it was important to shop on U Street. And a lot of times if you were shopping on U Street, you were shopping Black owned. Then what you're seeing right now is my favorite U Street landmark. And you're probably like, Briana, really? Like that one? But this is my favorite, and I'll tell you why. The True Reformers building, which is still there today, it opened in 1903. And when it opened, it really put U Street on the map as a main street in DC. Prior to this, there was no reason to come to U Street. Wasn't anything going on, nothing spectacular. But this building, which was designed by DC's first registered Black architect, his name is John Langford. It cost more than $60,000 to design. They only used Black people for the funding, for the construction, for the architecture, for the design, which this would have been abnormal in 1903. And it became a big deal because it was full of Black-owned businesses. There was a pharmacy. There was a tailor and design school. There was also a gymnasium. There was also, I think if you skip to the next slide, I have the mural up. Yep, there we go. This is also the place where Duke Ellington performed his very first show ever. It wasn't at the Howard Theater, the Lincoln Theater, the Republic, the Dunbar, the Booker T, all the other spaces he could have performed. It was actually here at this business and social hub with his band at the time called the Duke Serenaders. So there's still a mural to this day. This mural was done by Byron Peck, who's a local muralist. And it depicts an older Duke Ellington, although it was a young Duke Ellington who performed here. But it just honors, that Black Broadway history and how special these places are. You can go to the next slide, and we're going to go through. You can skip this one. All right. So this is the point where you'll get hungry if you didn't have lunch yet. All right. Put in the chat if you've been to Ben's Chili Bowl. I'm sure there's a lot of yeses for this one. Okay, Tiana, can you tell me what a half smoke is? Have you had a half smoke before?
I have had a half smoke. My family loves half smokes. It's like a hot dog but better. It's bigger, it's meatier. I don't know the proper terms, but
that was
a hot dog but better. Yeah,
Perfect.
and spicy.
Yes, and spicy. I'm glad you said that. That's actually one of Ben's secret recipes, is that he wanted to make something that was a little spicier than other folks hot dogs or half smokes. And half smokes are a DC staple. In fact, when I'm doing walking tours and I have folks that are coming from all around the world, and I go on and spill about half smokes, and then someone's like, wait, what is a half smoke? And I have to remember that that is really a local piece of DC. I'm going to get a half smoke. Yes. So Ben's Chili Bowl is one out of three Black owned businesses that have survived from the Black Broadway era that are still owned and operated by the original founding families. Remember, I said there were more than 300. Now, present day, there's just three. It was actually that fact that encouraged me to expand my photo story essay into a book, because I couldn't believe how much of the history has been lost. So much of the history has been lost because residents have been pushed out of the area due to a number of factors, starting way back from desegregation, going through the 1968 uprising, and most recently gentrification as well. But there are still businesses that are around, and I like to highlight and keep their legacies alive. And so Ben's Chili Bowl opened in 1958. They are actually the youngest out of the three. In the middle there of that photo, that is Miss Virginia Ali, who is the co-founder. She founded Ben's with her husband, Ben, who is now deceased. They got married in 1958, and then they went into business together in 1958, which I think is the cutest love story. She's still at the restaurant often. That is me in the photo. I'm smiling like that because she's holding a copy of my book. So I've had the pleasure of interviewing her a number of times throughout the years to get her narratives about the history that's in my book as well. And Ben's Chili Bowl has welcomed a number of celebrities, comedians, singers, performers, some of which you can see on the side of their building. They have that really beautiful mural, which is also done by a DC artist, that highlights what they would call their wall of fame if you were to go inside of their restaurant and see a lot of the people that have contributed not just to Ben's history, but DC's history. Okay, the next slide. We can skip that one. That's just Ben's Chili Bowl in the 80s, which looks the same. Another business I love to highlight, and the Lee's family are so awesome. This is Lee's Flower and Card Shop. I don't know if anyone has visited here, but definitely check it out, especially as we go into Valentine's Day mode. You can pick up some flowers from this fourth generation operating Black-owned business in DC. They opened up a second location in Union Station about a year ago, but they've been on U Street for almost now, pushing 100 years soon. 20 years will go by quick. But they opened up in 1945. Who you see in this photograph in the center is Miss Winifred Lee, who is the co-founder. She founded this business with her husband, William Lee. To the left and right, you have Christy and Stacy, who are their granddaughters, and they currently are the operators and the managers, president of Lee's Flower and Card Shop. And they are business number 2 that is still around from the Black Broadway era. You can go forward. And this is my favorite mural. So definitely come on a tour with me so you can see it in person. But this is totally airbrushed. So if you've ever just went on an art walk in DC, or even just Maryland or Virginia, because DMV, we have beautiful art all over the place, right? A lot of times you see vinyl or you'll see like actual paint. This is totally airbrushed, which is just the coolest thing. You see the detail of the eyes and the teeth and the glasses. So I just love pointing out this mural. But it's a portrait of Winifred and William. And Lee's Flower and Card Shop has continued to be a staple in the community. And one of the reasons when I've talked to the family is because they own the building. And it's so a large part of when we're talking about Black history and also continuing Black advancement and progression and things of that nature. Ownership, property ownership, home ownership is a large part of being able to preserve spaces. You go to the next slide, I think we'll run into our third business. And this is Industrial Bank. Now, Industrial Bank is the oldest. They opened in 1913. They were originally opened by John Whitelaw, who also owned the Bohemian Caverns, which is right across the street and a very popular jazz after-hour spot. It's no longer the Caverns. There's 2 other places there now. But Industrial Bank opened, and it was the first black bank in DC. And you can imagine how important it is to have a bank in any community, but especially during a time of segregation. And this bank is a large part of why there's also so many businesses in the neighborhood. Some of the longtime residents and business owners that I had the pleasure of interviewing for their oral histories, they would tell me stories about if they needed to do a building renovation, they would literally walk across the street to Industrial Bank, shake hands with Mr. Mitchell, and would have a loan. Back then you didn't have all these contracts and paperwork. But that was the heart of Black Broadway. It was a close-knit community, and people really supported one another. So Industrial Bank is still around today. They closed briefly during the Great Depression, reopened in 1934, and who reopened it was Jesse Mitchell, who's a Howard University graduate. And he actually opened this bank at the age of 21 years old. I know. I'm always like, what was I doing at 21? Not opening a bank.
Right.
But this business is still around. They have multiple locations, DC, Maryland, a few in New York and New Jersey as well. Okay, next slide. So I do want to point this out before I get into, this is kind of my segue into talking about the education and activism aspect of my Black Broadway research. But I do want to note that although I'm highlighting the diversity of Black Broadway, I don't want you to think that that meant that every single business within the neighborhood was Black owned, because it wasn't. That wasn't the case. Now, there were a lot in majority, but that doesn't mean there were all. And one of those businesses that weren't, for instance, would have been a place like People's Drugstore. And they were known to be prejudiced and discriminatory against patrons of color. They had no issue with people coming to spend their money, but they didn't want to hire African Americans. And this became a problem during the Great Depression, especially when people were losing their jobs, and usually the first to be fired would have been African Americans. But out of this, there came activism that really became the precursor to a lot of the civil rights movement protests. The NAACP actually took strategies from this organization and the way they picketed out front of different businesses. And the name of this group, which is definitely not as popular as the NAACP, but they should still get all of their flowers, it is the New Negro Alliance. And they banded together. It was school leaders, community leaders, and politicians. I don't know if I have a photo on the next slide. If you flip forward, let's see. Do I have it? Yes, I do. And in the center here, you may know who this lady is. She's very famous. It's Mary McLeod Bethune. She's not from DC, but she owned a house in Bloomingdale because she did a lot of activism in Washington, D.C. Specifically, right now, she's on Black Broadway at the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA. And she also helped out with the New Negro Alliance. And they went on to eventually secure about 5,000 jobs for Black people within the community. And also, they won a major Supreme Court case against a store, which goes by a different name now. And if you shop there, I don't want you to feel bad about it, but they used to be called Sanitary Grocery Company. They changed their name, and they are now Safeway. So Safeway has a pretty discriminatory past, but it was the New Negro Alliance that actually won a Supreme Court case against them so they would start to hire workers of color. Okay, let's get into the education, and we're going to wrap this up here so we can take some of your questions. And let's play another trivia. I know you all logged on for Lunch and Learn, and it's turned into Lunch and Trivia. Can you guess this historically Black university? Your hint is it's in Washington, D.C., and it's an HBCU. Those are your two hints. Any guesses?
Let's see.
I'll give it a few seconds for anyone in the chat if you know where this is. Maybe you attended it. Maybe you have a kid that goes here. Okay, I see it. I saw that said Howard University. Yes, you got it. Round of applause. This is Howard University. I get this question often of, okay, I know Black Broadway is exciting, it's special, it means a lot, not just now, but even before, but also present day. But what makes it different? I see an HU, what makes it different from other places during this time period that are thriving Black neighborhoods, Philadelphia, right? New Orleans, of course, Harlem, Chicago, eventually even Detroit. These different places that have similar stories. Tulsa. Well, what makes it different is Howard University. These other places don't have a Howard in their backyard. Howard University is founded in 1867, and it's founded out of what is called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government assistance program that helped newly freed enslaved persons with housing, education, and employment. Now, I'm not going to glorify this to say everyone was getting thousands of dollars in checks, because that's not the case. But it was something to help Black people move forward and really start their lives after enslavement. So out of the Freedmen's Bureau, the same president of that, which is a white gentleman named General Oliver Otis Howard, who was a Civil War hero. We like him. He's not canceled. He did a lot for the Black community. He also founded Howard University, and that's why it's named after Howard. This university is diverse from the beginning. They are not segregated. I have old photographs. I think if you go forward, I might have one up. But there's photographs of Black and white students learning together. This is Howard's first Black president. His name is Mordecai Johnson. Howard was always good at letting anyone show up and come to class and things of that nature, but they mostly had white faculty members and leaders. It wasn't until Mordecai Johnson, who was their president that was inducted in 1927, came onto the scene, and he really turned the campus completely around. Schools that were getting ready to lose their accreditation, like the Howard University Law School, was totally transformed. And over this time period, while he was at Howard, 96%. Okay, that is my pug. There's another dog. I would mute myself.
We love dogs. We love dogs. Okay. Keep them coming.
Okay. But Mordecai Johnson, under his leadership, 96% of Howard University's lawyers, 96%, I mean, of America's Black lawyers came from Howard University. And more than 54% of their physicians and dentists in America, Black America specifically, came from Howard University. Those are major numbers. And a lot of it had to do with Mordecai Johnson. One of those lawyers I'll highlight, I think, is on the next slide or the slide after. Okay, so this is the laboratory classroom photo I wanted you to see. Also, just shout out to the hairstyles for a minute. Can we just pause for the hair, the cut, the parts? I mean, I just love it. The next slide. This guy here is another very famous man. And for time's sake, I will tell you who it is, even though I'm sure you scholars know that this is Thurgood Marshall. And he is the most famous Black lawyer to come out of Howard University. And I would say one of the most famous in history. He is responsible for helping to win Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which desegregates school in America. But he was a student of Howard University's law school, and his mentor is a man who's not as famous, but is one of my favorite Black Broadway heroes. His name is Charles Hamilton Houston, and he is known as the man who killed Jim Crow, because it was his leadership being hired by Mordecai Johnson who gave an instruction that basically said, look, the only way to beat this legal system is we have to make more Black lawyers and more Black judges. And that's exactly what they did together. And one of those amazing people was the product of that was Thurgood Marshall. All right, I think we only have maybe two more, so we can skip this. This is LeDroit Park, and I'll tell you about LeDroit Park in connection with talking about, I believe, yes, this person in the next screen. This is my ultimate favorite Black Broadway history maker, and it is Mary Church Terrell. Sometimes I just wish I could travel through time and meet different people, and she's one of them. Mary Church Terrell, she did so much for not just the DC community, but America at large. She really fought hard for education rights, for employment rights. Even in her 80s, one of her last really big wins was that she was responsible for winning the case that desegregated public spaces in Washington, D.C. So, not just the schools, but we're talking about being able to go to a theater, being able to go to restaurants. She's responsible for that. She's also one of the founding members of the NAACP. I know history will say it was completely founded by what is going
I'll just say again that babies and dogs are, we love presentations, but when we are graced with people's pet animals, our family animals, we are very grateful.
Sorry about that. Yeah, someone knocked on my. This is the thing about recording at home. But someone knocked on my door, so now my pug is just going wild. Um, but anyway, so I will actually wrap this up because I don't know if he's going to stop, and I'll start taking questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And I really mean it. Don't worry about the dog. Don't worry. But we love it. That was fantastic. There was lots of great comments in the chat. I love the trivia. I do want to just go back to something that you said in your slide, and I don't know if you can still hear me, but I will say that you talked about airbrushing as a mural technique, or people who are watching at home, if you know the answer to this, feel free to jump in and tell me the answer. Talking about airbrushing as a mural technique as it relates to Lee's flower shop, and Briana differentiated it from paint. And so this is just a little detail, but I was so curious about how airbrushing is different than like as a paint mural. And so if anybody from the chat wants to jump in and tell me, I would love to know about that. Or Briana, if you know, I would love to know.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Sorry, I needed to step away to get to the door, so I apologize. But now it's quiet.
Okay. I had a very brief and really unimportant question, but I just was curious about if you just in like one sentence, can you tell me the difference? You specified with the Lee's Flower Shop mural that it was really special because it was airbrush versus paint. And I actually just don't know what the difference is. And can you just tell us what the difference is? Really
quickly? Yeah, I can. So the airbrush is done with like I'm not an artist, but it's done with like an actual airbrush gun. So if you've ever, I don't know if you've ever done airbrush, but it's just a different tool versus if you're painting, that's more of like actual hand painting. The airbrush is done with more of a spray gun. I don't know the proper way to say it, but that's how it's harder to be detailed with it because
I was just thinking that it would be
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I do have a question, but I wanted to point out the beauty of this. So we're sort of ushering in Black History Month with you, talking about the DC Renaissance and Black Broadway in DC. Next week, Lunch and Learn, we're going to be talking with an author, Noliwe Brooks, who her book is about Mary McLeod Bethune, who you mentioned as a part of the DC Renaissance. And then we're ending Black History Month with George M. Johnson, who's going to be talking about the Harlem Renaissance. And you hit all of those points in your presentation. So I just wanted to point that out. But I guess my first question is, like, going back to before you started your walking tours, what gap did you see in the market? Like, what made you say, this is what I need to do?
Yeah. That's you know what? No one's ever asked me that question before. So I would say for the walking tours, I'll tell you how it started was because I didn't plan to be a tour guide. I am a writer all the way, okay? But I started tour guiding because my book came out still at the height of the pandemic. And a lot of my talks were like this, virtual, and people didn't feel safe or comfortable being outside. So folks that got the book were like, hey, well, we could go see these places outside. And I kept getting different requests to tour guide, and I was like, all right, I'll try it. So I partnered with another woman-owned company, and in doing so, I discovered that there were not a ton of independent tour guides who were Black. There's some more now, one thing that we're all trying to do is to get younger folks. I mean, I'm still fairly young, but I'm not in my 20s anymore. But that was a gap. So it was really that I was a woman, I'm Black, and at the time I was in my late 20s telling this history that is way older than myself. And so that was a gap, is that just that independent aspect, and then the local aspect. That's something that was missing in the market that I really get, that I'm happy that I can bring, and that a lot of people, I didn't realize it matters so much, but that's a lot of feedback that I get even from guests, is they're always excited that they can hear the history from someone who is local, and someone who is Black, and telling their own story. And that's so important for me in my research. The back of my book is actually titled The Voices of U Street. That's what I wanted the title to be. And my editor was like, nope, we're going with Black Broadway. And I'm like, that's okay. I like that too. But the reason it's Voices of U Street is because when you're talking about history, often history is lost because the people that have lived through it don't get to tell their own story. So I thought it was so important that if you're going to tell any sort of narrative, you give the microphone back to the people that actually lived through it, the people that experienced it, who walked through it. And I think doing my walking tours and being able to tell it from that perspective adds that to the market, and something that you don't always see in tours in the area.
So the foreword to your book is written by Eleanor Holmes Norton. Like, how did that happen? How did you get that?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a funny story. So I'm still a journalist, but I do it freelance now instead of full time. But I was recently had stopped working on Capitol Hill for like the end of my year University of Maryland College Park project. So I kind of had my Capitol Hill contacts, and I found out in my research that Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton is a graduate of Dunbar High School. I didn't get to this point, which would have been the very last slide in my presentation, but Dunbar High School is the first public high school in America to admit Black students. Formerly, they were M Street High School. Prior to that, they were the college, or the preparatory college for Negro youth, and it was founded in the basement of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which is a Black church that's still around today. I tell you all this history because it's very significant to the Black Broadway history. People have to learn and go to school. It also is tied to Howard because you had PhD folks graduating from Howard, then teaching high school kids at M Street because they didn't have other places that would accept them. I say all this because Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton came out of this era and was taught at this school and trained by these elite folk. And, you know, I'm like, this is so cool. I have to interview her. So she accepted the interview, which I was shocked that happened. I went, was able to interview her in person in her office. And at the end of the interview, I said she'd already gotten up, walked away, went to her desk. And I'm cleaning up, my notes. And I'm like, hey, I just have a question. Would you be interested in writing the foreword to my book? And she paused and she said, well, I haven't written anything in a while and I've been wanting to. So yeah, I'll do it. And I literally screamed. I screamed in her office, which is also embarrassing. And I'm like, security, please don't put me out. But that's how it happened. And she wrote the foreword. To this day. Just November, I had the pleasure of introducing her at one of her at a ceremony. And so it's just awesome to have those firsthand narratives.
I think we have a question in the chat. Do you want to take
I was
that?
supposed to put it up.
All right.
Can you talk a little about the gentrification of Black Broadway and present-day landmark preservation initiatives from Allison?
Yes, thank you, Allison, for the question. So, one, gentrification is a huge issue. And I will start by defining it. I don't know if everyone knows what it is. So let's start by defining it. And gentrification, in the simplest terms, is really when a low-income neighborhood becomes a high-income neighborhood. That does affect color. It also, it affects background. The root of it is money. Property values go up. Developers say, hey, we can buy this and flip it for 3 times the amount, which is what happened on U Street. And because of that, people that built the culture of the space, the area, the music, the entertainment, the food scene are no longer able to even afford the place that they made cool, or even safe to be in. And so this is a case that has happened throughout all of America, but DC specifically is the fastest gentrifying city than any other city in America. And mainly because there's a lot of people, but it's a little bit of space. And so U Street has faced this and continues to face this issue. I would say present day initiatives, to be honest with you, I don't know how many. The biggest initiative that I've seen, and I know Mayor Bowser has really pushed, has been making it so that you have to have affordable housing. When you decide you're going to build a new development, a new apartment complex, a certain amount of that housing has to go to low income, things of that nature. Aside from that, there are, of course, the ANC commissioners, communities that are constantly trying to do the work to keep people buying and shopping and spending their dollars on U Street, because that's a big way to combat gentrification. But at large, I think there's still a lot of work that's going to have to be done to make the U Street corridor affordable for everyone to live. And even when I interview people to this day, they still kind of have the same answers. I'm not sure we would ever have another Black Broadway, just because of the climate of the market, and other factors. But in closing, I do want to make a note, and I hope that you get the book to see all the history. It's unfair to credit the decline of Black Broadway to gentrification only. There's so many factors over the span of the last 100 years that really contribute to Black people moving out of the area. And also, at some point, it goes from Black people having the choice to Black people being displaced. And that's what we see in gentrification. Prior to, with desegregation, it was access. At one point, I couldn't go anywhere else. Now, I can.
I just wanted to thank you for this book. I've been in this area for roughly like 14 years now. And I love when someone writes a book that I want to go jump on the metro and go see. And so Tiana and I and Kyla, probably we as well, we were just curious if the cold weather keeps your tours from running as frequently. And do we get a discount? Because we really want to come.
Yes, that's funny. Okay, so yes, the cold weather does, So my tour season really starts for public individual ticketed tours in March. And we actually have a tour on, I believe it's March 1st, whatever that first Saturday is in March. So if you go to Eventbrite, it's not going to be in my website, but if you just look up Black Broadway, Briana Thomas on Eventbrite, you'll find it. The tours are $45 per person. Yes, I could offer you a discount for sure. We need to do a group tour together. So those run from March through November, because when it gets cold, I had a group that wanted December and we did a tour. We were freezing. But I do still do tours year round, but usually private group tours. So let's say you are part of an organization or a corporate group and you want to share this history with your students. Those are year round, but those public ticketed tours are going to be every first Saturday of the month beginning in March.
We'd actually like to buy you lunch more than we would have you give us a discount, because that's kind of our thing.
Maybe we can do a tour and lunch. And people watching at home, I'm just saying, sounds like March 1st might be the hot date. So
yeah,
there's a link in the chat for anybody who wants to find out more about how to sign up for one of these tours. We have a lot of questions, and I'm sensitive to time. So I will say, if anybody's watching, another audience member has a question, now's your chance to type in really fast before we get to the end. One of the things that it's actually a question that Tiana had, but I thought it was wonderful, and I want to just talk about it. Tiana's, recognizes, you're a journalist, you're a business owner, you're an assistant pastor. So can we talk about how you prioritize and have all of these different roles in your life?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I will try to give you the short answer. And at this point, it's just practice. It really just kind of things just led into the other. So me being a journalist is what led me to being a historian, and an author, and being an author is what led me into being a tour company owner, right? And the only thing that I didn't go into by trade, but inheritance, which is also why the Black Broadway story is so special, because it's a lot of family tradition and legacy. My parents were pastors. They both have passed away now, but when they passed on, my dad in 2018, my mom in 2005. But when my dad passed away, my twin brother and I, which is another fun fact, I have a twin brother, so there's another one of me running around here. We inherited the ministry, and so we have a church based in DC. And yeah, it just takes practice. It takes and also I go out a lot. I just like having fun and going to theater and shows. So just being open to try new things, and I have a lot of good friends that are supportive too in all of my different spheres of what I do.
Can I ask about your grandma?
Yeah.
My great grandmother was a flapper, which I thought was fantastically fun to know. So I just would love to know about your grandma, like
Yes.
just a little, because you dedicated your book, you spoke about her, but I just curious, like how you knew her back then, like what was she like, what was she doing?
Okay, so my grandmother, Evelyn Thomas, who just celebrated her 85th birthday about 2 weeks ago. She was born and raised in Suffolk, Virginia, and she came to DC right after high school. And this was not abnormal for women of color during this time because DC was more progressive. There were more opportunities. Virginia Ali actually has a similar story. She moved from Virginia. Her name is Virginia. And her first job was at Industrial Bank, which is another fun fact. And both businesses are around today. But she came to DC. She ended up got married, and that didn't work out. But she had my dad, raised him in DC, eventually moved to Maryland, and that's kind of where my family got its roots. But while she was in DC, she liked to go out and she liked to have fun. And when I first told her that I was researching this history, it was literally the most adorable thing. And I still have it to this day. She made a handmade map for me, and she put down like the different streets and the landmarks and the places she went, and then the list of all like the shows she could remember going to. And it's the coolest thing. I wish I could have put that in my book, because that's kind of my own special attachment to the history. But my grandma, she's really cool.
So I had a question, and it's based on a quote in your book from Isetta Peters. Is that how her name is pronounced? Isetta? Um, but she talks about how when they were able to start day working, that's when churches started opening up more days a week, and that's how there were more clubs formed and they were able to organize. So I wanted to talk about, or ask if you could talk about, both from a historical perspective but also from your just personal experience, how has the church historically and presently, what am I trying to say? Like, helped people find community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a good question because someone mentioned gentrification and the effects. And and I know, everyone has their own religions, but worship spaces have long been the backbones of communities. That's just all over the world, right? That's not unique to America. And specifically, the Black church was the beginnings. Like I mentioned, the first public high school was from a Black church, was the first schools. And if you read that chapter on live-in and day-out workers for women, it was the beginning of social clubs. And those social clubs turned into places like Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, where you had women who could literally live there and bring their kids and have safe play areas and things of that nature. And when those spaces are removed, and this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, but Lincoln Temple, which was about 150 years old when it closed, and they closed because of gentrification. They can no longer afford it. A developer bought the lot. And then when parishioners have to move out the area, well, they're not coming to church and they're not contributing to the church. So all of those things are factors. But the church is often the space where if the city fails or the government fails with support, usually these are the places that are supporting their families or their communities or their schools. And when those are removed out the neighborhood, you see the effects of it. You see it with crime rising. You see it with Violence, that's still the issue. You see it with drugs in the neighborhood, and it's something that people like to brush over, but really the proof is in the pudding, even historically, that it really has been the backbone for the community. And I think that has an effect on what Black Broadway is today.
So unfortunately, we are at time. Brianna, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. This has been fabulous, and I feel like we say this every week, but we didn't even scratch the surface in the number of questions that we had today. It's been such a privilege hearing you speak. To all of you tuning in, whether live or watching on demand later, thank you so much for spending your time with us. You are why we do what we do. Join us on Tuesdays at noon for more Lunch and Learns. February guests include authors Noliwe Rooks, Kathleen Duval, and George M. Johnson. On Thursday at 4 p.m., the Community Conversation series welcomes Carmen Duran from the Department of Family Services. Visit the Office of Human Rights online at civilrights.mypgc.us and check out all of the amazing upcoming library programs at pgcmls.info/events. Again, thank you so much, Brianna, and all of our viewers. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon.